For anyone not closely following the chess match between Moscow and its former satellites, September 2024 seemed like just another energy negotiation. Azerbaijan announced it would not renew Russian energy transit agreements, a decision that should have prompted the usual behind-the-scenes diplomatic pressure from Moscow. The rationale was straightforward, if significant. Baku cited the need to diversify its energy partnerships and reduce dependence on Russian infrastructure. But what happened next wasn't the typical post-Soviet scramble to appease the Kremlin at all. Instead of backtracking or offering compromises, President Aliyev's government doubled down with public statements criticizing Russian energy policies across the region. This wasn't the Azerbaijan that Moscow had grown accustomed to managing. The new Azerbaijan that Moscow doesn't recognize. The Azerbaijan that Russian diplomats encountered in late 2023 bore little resemblance to the nation they faced 2 years later. Back then, Azerbaijani officials would carefully phrase their disagreements with Moscow in diplomatic language, couching criticism in terms of different perspectives or ongoing discussions. When Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov would lecture his Azerbaijani counterparts about regional stability, they would nod politely and promise to consider Moscow's concerns. The standard protocol involved private negotiations where Azerbaijan might quietly push back on Russian demands, but always within the bounds of what the Kremlin considered acceptable behavior from a former Soviet republic. By March 2025, that careful dance had evaporated entirely. During a summit meeting in Astana, Azerbaijani Foreign Minister Ceyhan Bayramov directly contradicted Russian positions on Caspian Sea energy development in front of international delegates. Rather than the usual diplomatic hedging, Bayramov stated bluntly that Azerbaijan would pursue its own interests regardless of Russian preferences. The shift wasn't subtle. When Russian officials attempted to invoke historical precedents about Moscow's traditional role in regional affairs, Azerbaijani representatives responded with visible impatience, cutting off Russian speakers and redirecting conversations toward bilateral partnerships with other nations. The psychological impact on Russian diplomatic personnel was immediate and profound. Career diplomats who had spent decades managing relationships with post-Soviet states suddenly found themselves dealing with counterparts who treated them as equals rather than superior powers. The Center for European Policy Analysis described the July 2024 police raids as pushing Azerbaijani-Russian relations to their lowest point since the Soviet collapse, noting that Russian officials expressed genuine shock at what they characterized as unprecedented disrespect from Baku. One particularly telling exchange involved a Russian deputy foreign minister complaining that Azerbaijani officials had stopped returning his phone calls promptly, treating communication with Moscow as just another item on their diplomatic agenda rather than a priority. This transformation reflected something deeper than mere diplomatic posturing. Azerbaijan's behavior represented a fundamental rejection of the post-imperial relationship model that had governed Russian interactions with former Soviet republics for 3 decades. The traditional framework assumed that Moscow retained inherent authority over regional affairs, with former Soviet states expected to defer to Russian judgment on matters of mutual concern. Azerbaijan's new approach operated from a completely different premise, that sovereign nations could pursue their own strategic interests without seeking Russian approval or accommodation. The confidence driving this shift stemmed from Azerbaijan's dramatically strengthened position across multiple domains. Military victories in Nagorno-Karabakh had demonstrated that Baku could achieve strategic objectives without Russian support or blessing. Despite casualties among 5 Russian peacekeepers, Russia did not intervene to prevent Azerbaijan's takeover, demonstrating Moscow's distraction by Ukraine. Economic diversification had reduced dependence on Russian markets and financial institutions. Energy partnerships with European nations and regional powers had created alternative revenue streams that diminished Moscow's leverage. These material changes translated directly into political boldness, as Azerbaijani leadership recognized that challenging Russia carried manageable risks rather than existential threats. The transformation was most visible in how bilateral disputes were handled. Previously, disagreements between Moscow and Baku would be resolved through quiet diplomatic channels, with Azerbaijan typically making concessions to maintain good relations. By 2024, this pattern had reversed completely, when Russia attempted to pressure Azerbaijan over energy transit arrangements. Baku responded with public statements criticizing Russian interference in sovereign affairs. When Moscow raised concerns about Azerbaijani military cooperation with NATO members, Azerbaijani officials dismissed these objections in press conferences, stating that their security partnerships were none of Russia's business. Russian foreign policy establishments struggled to comprehend this new reality. Policy papers circulated within the Kremlin consistently underestimated Azerbaijan's willingness to confront Moscow directly. Russian analysts had assumed that post-Soviet states would maintain traditional deference patterns even as they pursued gradual diversification of relationships. The possibility that a country like Azerbaijan would openly challenge Russian positions in international forums had not been seriously considered by Moscow's strategic planning apparatus. The shift from private complaints to public confrontation marked a crucial turning point in post-Soviet power dynamics. When Azerbaijan began criticizing Russian policies in speeches at international conferences, it signaled that Baku no longer feared retaliation from Moscow. This public dimension was particularly important because it demonstrated to other regional actors that challenging Russia was not only possible, but potentially beneficial. Each public disagreement between Azerbaijani and Russian officials sent a clear message that the old rules of engagement were no longer operative. The speed of this transformation caught Russian policymakers completely unprepared. Intelligence assessments from as late as early 2024 had characterized Azerbaijan as a reliable partner that will continue operating within Moscow's preferred framework for regional cooperation. The assumption that economic incentives and security concerns would maintain Azerbaijani compliance with Russian preferences proved fundamentally mistaken. By the time Russian officials recognized the depth of Azerbaijan's strategic reorientation, the window for preventing this shift had already closed. What made this change particularly significant was its genuine, rather than performative nature. Some post-Soviet states had occasionally engaged in diplomatic theater, making public statements that appeared to challenge Russian positions while privately maintaining cooperative relationships. Azerbaijan's approach was fundamentally different. The public confrontations reflected actual policy decisions and strategic priorities that often directly contradicted Russian interests. When Azerbaijani officials criticized Russian regional policies, they backed up their words with concrete actions that demonstrated their commitment to independent decision-making. The psychological warfare aspect of Azerbaijan's approach was particularly sophisticated. By treating Russian diplomatic pressure as ineffective rather than threatening, Azerbaijani officials projected confidence that undermined Moscow's perceived authority. When Russian representatives would invoke traditional arguments about regional stability or historical relationships, Azerbaijani counterparts would respond with barely concealed dismissal, suggesting that these appeals carried no weight in contemporary geopolitical calculations. The broader implications extended far beyond bilateral relations between Russia and Azerbaijan. The successful defiance of Russian pressure by a relatively small post-Soviet state demonstrated that Moscow's imperial model of regional control was no longer sustainable. Other nations in the region began studying Azerbaijan's approach, recognizing that the combination of economic diversification, military strengthening, and diplomatic boldness could provide a pathway to genuine independence from Russian influence. By late 2024, the pattern was unmistakable. Azerbaijan had fundamentally recalibrated its relationship with Russia, moving from a position of careful deference to one of confident assertion. The January 2025 confrontation that had seemed so surprising was actually the logical culmination of a much longer process of strategic reorientation. Russian attempts to restore the previous dynamic through economic pressure or diplomatic threats had proven ineffective against a nation that had successfully diversified its sources of security and prosperity. But the most telling sign of Azerbaijan's transformation wasn't found in diplomatic meetings or public statements. It was buried in technical documents and infrastructure contracts that most observers never bothered to examine. Energy wars, how oil changed everything. These contracts revealed Azerbaijan's most decisive break with Moscow's control. In September 2024, Azerbaijan's state energy company SOCAR informed its Russian counterparts that existing transit agreements would not be renewed beyond their 2025 expiration dates. For decades, Azerbaijani oil and gas had flowed through Russian pipelines on its way to European markets, generating substantial transit fees for Moscow while keeping Baku dependent on Russian infrastructure. The message from SOCAR was clear: those days were ending permanently. The completion of the Trans-Adriatic pipeline expansion in late 2024 provided Azerbaijan with the technical capability to make good on this threat. The upgraded system could now carry 20 billion cubic meters of Azerbaijani gas annually directly to European markets, completely bypassing Russian territory. Additional pipeline connections through Georgia and Turkey created multiple redundant routes that eliminated any single point of failure. By early 2025, Russian transit infrastructure had become entirely optional for Azerbaijani energy exports rather than the essential choke point it had been for 3 decades. European energy markets, still reeling from the disruptions caused by the Ukraine invasion, welcomed Azerbaijani gas with unprecedented enthusiasm. The European Union's desperate search for alternatives to Russian energy created a seller's market that Azerbaijan was perfectly positioned to exploit. Long-term contracts signed throughout 2024 guaranteed premium prices for Azerbaijani energy, while providing the political cover that European governments needed to justify massive infrastructure investments. The EU pledged over $10 billion in investments in Baku, creating a financial relationship that dwarfed anything Russia could offer. The financial calculations were stark and immediate. Russia had been earning approximately $2.3 billion annually in transit fees from Azerbaijani energy exports, revenue that evaporated overnight when the new pipeline routes became operational. More importantly, Moscow lost the leverage that came from controlling energy flows. For years, Russian officials had been able to threaten pipeline shutdowns or maintenance delays whenever Azerbaijan stepped out of line politically. These threats became meaningless once Azerbaijan possessed independent routes to market. Azerbaijan's new energy partnerships extended far beyond simple buyer-seller relationships. Turkey became a crucial hub for Azerbaijani energy exports, with joint ventures that integrated the two countries' energy sectors at multiple levels. Israeli companies provided advanced drilling technology and offshore exploration expertise that Russian firms couldn't match. European energy giants offered long-term financing and technical support that came without the political strings attached to Russian deals. Each partnership reduced Azerbaijan's dependence on Russian expertise while creating new stakeholders with interests in Azerbaijani independence. The transformation from energy dependence to energy sovereignty had immediate political implications. When Russian officials attempted to pressure Azerbaijan over its support for Ukrainian grain exports in March 2025, Baku's response was swift and uncompromising. Rather than the careful diplomatic language that had characterized previous disagreements, Azerbaijani officials simply stated that Russia's opinions on the matter were irrelevant. The confidence came from knowing that Russian retaliation through energy infrastructure was no longer possible. Russia's attempts to maintain control over Caucasus energy flows became increasingly desperate and ultimately futile. Moscow offered discount pricing on pipeline transit in hopes of keeping some Azerbaijani exports flowing through Russian territory. When that failed, Russian energy companies proposed joint venture arrangements that would have maintained some degree of influence over Azerbaijani energy decisions. These proposals were rejected outright, with Azerbaijani officials making it clear that energy sovereignty was non-negotiable. The strategic implications extended beyond simple commercial relationships. Energy partnerships became security partnerships as recipient countries developed vested interests in protecting Azerbaijani energy infrastructure. When satellite imagery revealed unusual Russian military activity near the Georgian border in late 2024, Turkish and Israeli intelligence services shared information with Azerbaijani security forces about potential threats to pipeline infrastructure. The energy deals had created an informal security network that operated independently of Russian influence. The economic calculations that made defying Russia financially viable were straightforward. Before the pipeline diversification, Azerbaijan's energy revenue had been subject to Russian transit fees, maintenance costs, and political pressure that could disrupt exports at any time. The new arrangements eliminated these vulnerabilities while providing higher net revenues. In 2024, Azerbaijan's energy exports generated $18.7 billion in revenue, compared to $14.2 billion the previous year, when Russian transit fees and political constraints had limited market access. The domino effect was immediate and visible. Other energy-producing nations in the region began studying Azerbaijan's model, recognizing that energy independence could provide the foundation for broader political autonomy. Kazakhstan began exploring pipeline routes that would bypass Russian territory entirely. Turkmenistan initiated discussions with European companies about alternative export arrangements. The successful demonstration that energy sovereignty was achievable encouraged other post-Soviet states to challenge Russian control over their natural resources. The psychological impact on Russian energy officials was profound. For decades, control over post-Soviet energy flows had been a cornerstone of Russian regional influence. The assumption that geography and existing infrastructure would maintain Russian relevance proved fundamentally mistaken. Internal communications from Russian energy companies revealed genuine panic about losing market share and political influence as alternative routes became operational. The broader geopolitical implications became clear as 2025 progressed. The Trans-Caspian International Transport Route, connecting Europe and China via Georgia, Turkey, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan, saw cargo volumes surge to 4.5 million tons in 2024, compared to 1.5 million tons in 2022. This infrastructure development created economic incentives for multiple countries to maintain good relationships with Azerbaijan while reducing their dependence on Russian transit routes. Energy sovereignty transformed Azerbaijan's entire approach to international relations. When Russian officials attempted to invoke traditional arguments about regional stability or historical relationships, Azerbaijani counterparts could point to concrete alternatives that provided better terms without political interference. The ability to export energy independently meant that economic pressure from Moscow carried minimal credible threat, fundamentally altering the power dynamics that had governed regional relationships for 3 decades. The success of Azerbaijan's energy strategy demonstrated that economic independence was not only possible, but profitable. The combination of diversified export routes, premium pricing from European buyers, and reduced transit costs created a financial foundation that made political confrontation with Russia strategically viable. But energy revenues alone couldn't explain Azerbaijan's growing confidence in challenging Moscow directly. The real source of that boldness lay in a different kind of investment altogether: military modernization, building strength without Moscow. Azerbaijan's defense spending surge to $1.7 billion in 2025 represented a 128% increase from 2020 levels, revealing systematic preparation for military independence from Russian systems. Every procurement decision, every training program, every joint exercise pointed toward the same strategic goal: building armed forces that could operate effectively without Russian equipment, Russian advisors, or Russian approval. The weapons acquisitions that followed this budget expansion revealed the depth of Azerbaijan's strategic pivot. Indian defense contractors delivered 155mm ATAGS towed artillery systems alongside 72 units of 155mm MARG self-propelled guns. Pinaka multiple-launch rocket systems provided long-range strike capabilities that exceeded anything in the Russian export catalog. Akash surface-to-air missile systems offered air defense technology that Russian manufacturers couldn't match at comparable prices. The procurement list read like a deliberate rejection of Russian military technology, with each system representing a capability that Moscow had previously provided or controlled. French arms manufacturers added another dimension to Azerbaijan's military transformation. The delivery of 3 GM-200 radars and 36 Caesar 155mm self-propelled artillery systems demonstrated that European defense companies were willing to provide advanced technology without the political strings that came with Russian equivalents. These weren't simply weapons purchases, but technology transfers that enhanced Azerbaijan's indigenous defense capabilities. The French systems came with training programs, maintenance support, and upgrade pathways that created long-term partnerships independent of Russian influence. The 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh victory had provided more than military success. It offered a proven template for independence from Russian military systems. During that conflict, Turkish drones and Israeli precision munitions had outperformed Russian equipment in ways that shocked military analysts worldwide. The lessons learned weren't lost on Azerbaijani military planners. If modern, non-Russian weapons could deliver decisive victories against Russian-equipped opponents, then military independence wasn't just possible, but strategically superior. Pakistani defense cooperation added another layer to Azerbaijan's diversification strategy. Zen anti-drone technologies and Conquer-Zem anti-tank missiles provided capabilities that Russian systems couldn't deliver reliably. The Pakistani partnership was particularly significant because it demonstrated that Azerbaijan could access advanced military technology from multiple sources simultaneously. Russian officials had assumed that language barriers, maintenance requirements, and training costs would prevent post-Soviet states from successfully integrating diverse weapons systems. Azerbaijan's military proved this assumption wrong. The transformation was visible in inventory statistics that Russian defense officials found deeply unsettling. By 2024, Russian equipment represented less than 35% of Azerbaijan's major weapon systems, down from over 70% just 5 years earlier. This wasn't simply about new purchases replacing old equipment. Azerbaijani military units were actively phasing out Russian systems even when they remained functional. The message was clear. Military independence required complete technological separation from Russian defense infrastructure. Joint military exercises with Turkey and Israel created operational capabilities that Russian training programs had never provided. Turkish military advisors shared urban warfare techniques developed during operations in Syria and Iraq. Israeli instructors provided electronic warfare training that enabled Azerbaijani forces to counter Russian communication systems. These weren't ceremonial exercises, but intensive training programs that created interoperability between Azerbaijani forces and NATO standard equipment. The psychological impact of military modernization was immediate and profound. Azerbaijani military leaders who had previously deferred to Russian assessments of regional security threats began making independent strategic evaluations. When Russian officials warned about potential security risks from increased Western military cooperation, Azerbaijani commanders responded with confidence rather than concern. The enhanced military capabilities created a sense of strategic autonomy that translated directly into political assertiveness. Russian attempts to compete with alternative weapons suppliers revealed the limitations of Moscow's defense industrial base. Advanced drone technology, precision-guided munitions, and electronic warfare systems from Turkish and Israeli manufacturers consistently outperformed Russian equivalents in field testing. The performance gaps were so significant that Russian officials stopped offering competitive alternatives and instead focused on warning about the risks of relying on non-Russian military technology. These warnings fell on deaf ears as Azerbaijani military units reported consistently superior performance from their new weapons systems. The strategic implications extended beyond simple military capability. Military partnerships created political relationships that gradually displaced Russian influence. When Turkish military advisors established permanent training facilities in Azerbaijan, they brought with them intelligence, sharing agreements, and security guarantees that reduced the relevance of Russian security promises. Israeli defense contractors provided cybersecurity support that protected Azerbaijani military communications from Russian interference. Each military partnership created institutional relationships that operated independently of Russian oversight. Force projection capabilities that emerged from a modernization program fundamentally altered regional power dynamics. Azerbaijani military units, equipped with advanced artillery systems and precision-guided munitions, could now threaten Russian positions throughout the South Caucasus. The successful integration of multiple weapons systems from different suppliers created operational flexibility that Russian forces couldn't match. Military analysts noted that Azerbaijan's combined arms capabilities now rivaled those of Russian units stationed in the region. The confidence generated by military modernization enabled political confrontations that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. When Russian officials attempted to pressure Azerbaijan over energy cooperation with European partners, Azerbaijani responses included subtle references to military capabilities that could disrupt Russian regional operations. The implication was clear: military independence had created the foundation for political independence. By 2025, the transformation was complete. Azerbaijan possessed military capabilities that operated independently of Russian systems, training programs that emphasized interoperability with Western partners, and strategic partnerships that provided alternatives to Russian security guarantees. The military independence that had seemed impossible during the Soviet era had become the foundation for broader political autonomy. But the most significant of these new partnerships wasn't built on weapons contracts or training programs alone. The Turkish factor, Ankara's growing shadow. Turkish military presence in Azerbaijan expanded dramatically throughout 2024 and 2025, transforming from occasional joint exercises into a permanent strategic deployment. Turkish advisors established training facilities at 3 major Azerbaijani military bases, with over 200 Turkish military personnel stationed on long-term assignments. The expansion wasn't subtle or gradual. Turkish F-16 fighter jets began regular patrol flights over Azerbaijani airspace, ostensibly for training purposes but clearly demonstrating air defense capabilities that Russian forces couldn't ignore. Turkish air defense systems appeared at key strategic locations, including near the Iranian border and along transportation corridors connecting Azerbaijan to Georgia. Each deployment sent a clear message that Turkey was committed to defending Azerbaijani sovereignty against any potential aggressor. The security umbrella that emerged from this cooperation provided Azerbaijan with something Russia never offered: partnership without domination. Turkish military advisors worked alongside Azerbaijani counterparts rather than directing their activities. Training programs focused on enhancing Azerbaijani capabilities rather than creating dependence on Turkish support. When joint exercises simulated defensive scenarios, Turkish forces operated as equals rather than senior partners. This approach contrasted sharply with Russian military cooperation, which had historically emphasized Azerbaijani subordination to Russian strategic priorities. The psychological impact was immediate and profound, as Azerbaijani military leaders gained confidence in their ability to operate independently while maintaining strong alliance relationships. Economic integration between Ankara and Baku accelerated beyond simple trade relationships into deep structural cooperation. Bilateral trade volume reached $4.6 billion in 2024, representing a 67% increase from 2022 levels. Turkish construction companies secured major infrastructure contracts worth over $8 billion, including highway projects that connected Azerbaijan directly to Turkish transportation networks. Joint energy ventures established Turkish companies as partners in Azerbaijani gas exploration and export operations. Turkish banks opened branches in Baku and began offering financing for Azerbaijani businesses at rates that Russian financial institutions couldn't match. The economic ties created mutual dependencies that strengthened political cooperation while reducing Azerbaijan's need for Russian economic partnerships. Turkey's NATO membership provided Azerbaijan with indirect security guarantees that fundamentally altered regional power calculations. While Azerbaijan wasn't a NATO member, Turkish commitment to defending shared infrastructure and energy projects created scenarios where aggression against Azerbaijan could trigger broader alliance responses. Russian military planners recognized that attacking Turkish military advisors or Turkish-funded infrastructure in Azerbaijan would risk escalation with NATO forces. This dynamic created a security guarantee that extended beyond formal alliance structures, providing Azerbaijan with protection that Russian promises had never offered. The deterrent effect was visible in Russian military exercises, which began avoiding areas where Turkish forces were operating. Joint projects between Turkey and Azerbaijan systematically excluded Russian participation, creating parallel infrastructure that bypassed Russian influence entirely. The Middle Corridor transportation route connecting Central Asia to Europe through Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey carried 4.2 million tons of cargo in 2024 without touching Russian territory. Turkish and Azerbaijani engineers collaborated on upgrading the Baku-Tbilisi-Kars railway, which provided direct rail connections between the two countries while avoiding Russian rail networks. Energy pipeline projects linked Azerbaijani gas fields to Turkish distribution systems, creating export routes that operated independently of Russian infrastructure. Each project strengthened the Turkish-Azerbaijani alliance while demonstrating that Russian involvement was unnecessary for regional development. Cultural and linguistic connections reinforced the political partnership with emotional bonds that Russian relationships had always lacked. Turkish television programs dominated Azerbaijani media, with viewers preferring Turkish content over Russian alternatives. Educational exchanges sent thousands of Azerbaijani students to Turkish universities, creating personal relationships that strengthened long-term cooperation. Turkish language training programs in Azerbaijan attracted massive enrollment, while Russian language education declined sharply. Cultural festivals celebrated shared Turkic heritage, emphasizing historical connections that predated Russian imperial control. These soft power elements created popular support for Turkish partnership that Russian cultural programs had never achieved. Russian attempts to undermine the Turkish-Azerbaijani alliance revealed Moscow's fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship's foundations. Russian officials attempted to exploit historical tensions between Turkey and Azerbaijan, highlighting past disagreements over energy pricing and territorial issues. These efforts failed because they addressed superficial disputes rather than the deeper strategic alignment that drove cooperation. Moscow offered economic incentives to Azerbaijan for reducing cooperation with Turkey, including preferential energy pricing and investment commitments. Azerbaijani officials rejected these proposals without serious consideration, demonstrating that the Turkish partnership had become strategically essential rather than merely convenient. Turkish support provided Azerbaijan with the confidence necessary to confront Russian pressure directly. During diplomatic disputes, Azerbaijani officials began referencing Turkish military cooperation and security guarantees as factors that Russian threats couldn't overcome. When Russian representatives attempted to invoke traditional arguments about regional stability, Azerbaijani counterparts responded by highlighting Turkish commitments to defending Azerbaijani sovereignty. The Turkish alliance had transformed Azerbaijan's strategic calculations, making confrontation with Russia appear manageable rather than existentially risky. The contrast between Turkish and Russian approaches to partnership was stark and decisive. Turkey offered Azerbaijan modern military technology, favorable economic arrangements, and cultural respect without demanding political subordination. Russian partnership had historically required deference to Moscow's regional priorities, acceptance of Russian military presence, and accommodation of Russian economic interests. Turkish cooperation enhanced Azerbaijani capabilities while respecting Azerbaijani sovereignty. Russian cooperation had traditionally emphasized Azerbaijani dependence on Russian support and approval. By early 2025, Turkish alternatives had proven superior across every dimension of international cooperation that mattered to Azerbaijani strategic planners. Turkish military advisors had replaced Russian counterparts in key positions. Turkish companies had secured major infrastructure contracts that Russian firms had previously dominated. Turkish cultural programs had displaced Russian soft power initiatives. Turkish diplomatic support had provided Azerbaijan with international backing that Russian partnerships had never delivered. The transformation was complete, but Azerbaijan's challenge to Russian influence wasn't limited to conventional diplomatic, economic, or military domains. The most sophisticated confrontation was taking place in an arena where few observers were paying attention. Digital warfare, the cyber dimension. Azerbaijan's cyber warfare capabilities had evolved into sophisticated weapons that could strike Russian digital infrastructure with precision and timing that left Moscow's cybersecurity experts scrambling to respond. The attacks began at 3:47 a.m. Moscow time on February 8, 2024. Russian government servers across multiple ministries suddenly experienced coordinated disruptions that lasted exactly 47 minutes. The timing wasn't coincidental. Russian officials had spent the previous day criticizing Azerbaijan's energy partnerships with European nations, using language that Baku found particularly offensive. The cyber response was swift, sophisticated, and unmistakably Azerbaijani in origin. Digital forensics later revealed that the intrusions had originated from servers in Baku, using techniques that Russian cybersecurity experts recognized as distinctly non-Russian in approach. The development of indigenous cyber capabilities in Azerbaijan had accelerated dramatically throughout 2023 and 2024. Turkish cybersecurity firms provided advanced training programs that enhanced Azerbaijani technical expertise. Israeli technology companies shared sophisticated penetration testing tools that enabled Azerbaijani operators to identify vulnerabilities in Russian systems. European cybersecurity contractors established training facilities in Baku where Azerbaijani personnel learned advanced techniques for digital warfare and information operations. The investment in cyber capabilities wasn't defensive posturing, but offensive preparation for confronting Russian digital influence operations. The information warfare campaign that Azerbaijan launched against Russian narratives in the Caucasus was comprehensive and professionally executed. Azerbaijani media outlets began systematically challenging Russian historical accounts of regional conflicts, presenting alternative interpretations that emphasized Azerbaijan's sovereignty and independence. Social media networks carried carefully crafted content that highlighted Russian military failures and economic weaknesses. Professional content creators produced videos that mocked Russian claims about regional leadership while promoting Azerbaijani achievements in military modernization and economic development. Russian propaganda networks that had operated freely in Azerbaijan for decades found themselves under sustained digital attack. The offices of RT and Sputnik experienced repeated network intrusions that disrupted their broadcasting capabilities. Russian-language social media accounts promoting Moscow's regional policies were systematically identified and targeted with counter-messaging that undermined their credibility. Azerbaijani cyber operators developed techniques for disrupting Russian bot networks, reducing their effectiveness in shaping online conversations about regional affairs. The technical sophistication of these operations impressed Western intelligence agencies who had underestimated Azerbaijani capabilities in cyber warfare. Social media platforms became battlegrounds where Azerbaijani public opinion was systematically mobilized against Russian influence. Government-coordinated campaigns encouraged citizens to share content that celebrated Azerbaijani independence and criticized Russian interference. Viral videos showed Azerbaijani military units training with advanced Turkish and Israeli weapons, emphasizing the superiority of non-Russian equipment. Online discussions promoted economic partnerships with Western nations while highlighting the failures of Russian economic cooperation. The sophistication of Azerbaijani cyber operations revealed capabilities that Russian intelligence services had failed to anticipate. Advanced persistent threats targeting Russian government networks demonstrated technical expertise that rivaled state-level cyber warfare programs. Information operations showed understanding of Russian psychological vulnerabilities and communication patterns. The coordination between cyber attacks and diplomatic confrontations indicated strategic planning that integrated digital warfare with broader foreign policy objectives. Russian attempts to respond to Azerbaijani digital provocations exposed significant weaknesses in Moscow's cyber warfare capabilities. Counterattacks against Azerbaijani government networks were quickly neutralized by defensive systems that incorporated Western cybersecurity technologies. Information operations designed to undermine Azerbaijani public support for anti-Russian policies failed to gain traction on social media platforms where Azerbaijani content creators had established dominant positions. The timing of cyber operations was carefully coordinated with diplomatic and economic pressure campaigns. When Russian officials made threatening statements about Azerbaijani energy partnerships, cyber attacks on Russian infrastructure followed within hours. Information warfare campaigns intensified during periods of diplomatic tension, creating public pressure that supported Azerbaijani government positions. Economic disputes were accompanied by cyber operations that disrupted Russian business networks and communication systems. The psychological impact of successful cyber operations on Russian officials was profound and visible. Internal communications intercepted by Western intelligence agencies revealed genuine concern about Azerbaijani technical capabilities. Russian cybersecurity budgets were increased specifically to address threats from post-Soviet states that had previously been considered technologically inferior. Training programs for Russian cyber warfare personnel were expanded to include defensive techniques against the specific methods that Azerbaijani operators had employed. Information warfare became a tool of statecraft that complemented traditional diplomatic pressure. Azerbaijani media campaigns systematically undermined Russian credibility on regional issues by highlighting Moscow's military failures in Ukraine and economic problems caused by international sanctions. Social media operations promoted narratives that portrayed Russia as a declining power whose influence in the Caucasus was based on outdated imperial ambitions rather than contemporary relevance. The demonstration that Azerbaijan had mastered hybrid warfare tactics that Russia had pioneered was particularly significant. Information operations that combined cyber attacks with media campaigns followed the same strategic framework that Russian intelligence services had used against Western targets. The technical execution showed familiarity with Russian methods while incorporating improvements that enhanced effectiveness. Azerbaijani operators had studied Russian hybrid warfare techniques and developed superior versions that could be deployed against their originators. The success of Azerbaijani cyber operations encouraged other post-Soviet states to develop similar capabilities. Georgian cybersecurity agencies began recruiting personnel with experience in penetration testing and information warfare. Ukrainian intelligence services shared techniques for disrupting Russian propaganda networks with Azerbaijani counterparts. The recognition that effective cyber warfare could neutralize Russian digital influence operations provided a template for other nations seeking to reduce Moscow's information dominance. But digital warfare alone couldn't sustain Azerbaijan's confrontation with Moscow indefinitely. The cyber capabilities that enabled political defiance required economic foundations that could withstand Russian retaliation. The real test of Azerbaijan's independence would come when Moscow attempted to use its traditional weapon of economic pressure to force compliance with Russian demands. Economic decoupling, following the money. The financial data revealed the scope of Azerbaijan's systematic campaign to eliminate Russian economic influence. Trade volumes between the two countries collapsed to $4.8 billion in 2024, down from $7.2 billion just 2 years earlier. The decline wasn't gradual market adjustment, but deliberate economic warfare. Azerbaijan's exports to Russia fell by 34% year over year, while imports from Russia dropped 41%. Each monthly report showed further deterioration as Azerbaijani businesses actively sought alternatives to Russian suppliers, even when replacement arrangements meant higher costs or longer delivery times. The systematic reduction of economic dependence became visible across every sector simultaneously. Agricultural producers canceled long-term contracts with Russian distributors, choosing instead to develop relationships with Turkish and European buyers. Manufacturing companies terminated licensing agreements with Russian technology providers, opting for more expensive alternatives from Western suppliers. Service sector businesses ended partnerships with Russian firms, even when replacement arrangements required significant restructuring costs. The pattern was consistent and deliberate. Azerbaijan was willing to accept short-term economic pain to achieve long-term independence from Russian commercial relationships. Banking relationships experienced the most dramatic transformation. Azerbaijani financial institutions began systematically closing correspondent accounts with Russian banks, reducing the flow of trade finance that had facilitated bilateral commerce for decades. The Central Bank of Azerbaijan imposed new compliance requirements that made transactions with Russian entities increasingly difficult and expensive. Local banks stopped accepting Russian rubles for international transactions, forcing businesses to use alternative currencies that circumvented Russian financial systems. By late 2024, banking relationships between the two countries had shrunk to minimal levels, with most transactions requiring complex workarounds that increased costs while reducing Russian oversight. New trade routes that bypassed Russian territory entirely began carrying increasing volumes of Azerbaijani commerce. The Middle Corridor transported 4.2 million tons of cargo in 2024, representing a 180% increase from 2022 levels. Rail connections through Georgia and Turkey carried Azerbaijani exports directly to European markets without touching Russian infrastructure. Maritime shipping through the Caspian Sea connected Azerbaijan to Central Asian markets while avoiding Russian ports. Each alternative route reduced Russian leverage by demonstrating that Azerbaijan could access international markets without Russian cooperation or approval. Export market diversification exceeded even optimistic projections. European buyers increased purchases of Azerbaijani goods by 67% in 2024, with Germany and Italy becoming major markets for non-energy exports. Turkish importers expanded their relationships with Azerbaijani suppliers across multiple sectors, from textiles to processed foods. Middle Eastern markets that had previously been accessed through Russian intermediaries began direct commercial relationships with Azerbaijani exporters. The diversification created multiple revenue streams that reduced the importance of Russian markets from essential to optional. Economic independence enabled political independence in ways that became immediately apparent. When Russian officials threatened trade sanctions over Azerbaijan's support for Ukrainian grain exports, Azerbaijani responses emphasized that Russian markets represented a small and shrinking portion of total trade. The threats that had once carried credible economic consequences now appeared hollow because Azerbaijan had successfully reduced its vulnerability to Russian economic pressure. Political confrontations that would have been economically suicidal just years earlier became strategically manageable once alternative markets were established. Russian attempts to maintain economic influence through sanctions threats backfired spectacularly. When Moscow imposed restrictions on Azerbaijani food imports in response to diplomatic tensions, Azerbaijani exporters simply redirected shipments to Turkish and European buyers who offered better prices. Russian threats to restrict energy cooperation prompted Azerbaijan to accelerate pipeline projects that eliminated Russian involvement entirely. Each sanctions threat strengthened Azerbaijani resolve to reduce economic ties with Russia, while demonstrating that Russian economic leverage had become largely ineffective. Alternative economic partnerships that emerged throughout 2024 fundamentally changed the cost-benefit analysis of confronting Russia. Turkish companies offered long-term contracts with favorable pricing that exceeded what Russian buyers had historically provided. European investors committed $12 billion in infrastructure projects that created employment and technology transfer opportunities. Israeli firms provided technical expertise and financing for agricultural modernization that enhanced productivity beyond what Russian cooperation had achieved. The economic benefits of diversification exceeded the costs of confronting Russia, making political independence financially advantageous rather than expensive. The sequencing was crucial and deliberate. Economic decoupling preceded political confrontation by approximately 18 months, providing Azerbaijan with the financial foundation necessary for sustained diplomatic pressure. Commercial relationships with alternative partners were established before diplomatic tensions escalated, ensuring that economic retaliation from Russia would have minimal impact. Export markets were diversified before energy partnerships were terminated, creating revenue streams that could absorb temporary disruptions. The strategic planning demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how economic independence enables political autonomy. Other post-Soviet states began studying Azerbaijan's economic strategy with intense interest. Georgian trade officials examined how Azerbaijan had successfully redirected exports away from Russian markets. Armenian businesses explored alternative suppliers that could replace Russian products and services. Even Kazakhstan, with its much larger economy, initiated discussions about reducing economic dependence on Russian infrastructure and markets. The demonstration that economic decoupling was both possible and profitable provided a template that other nations could adapt to their specific circumstances. The psychological impact on Russian business leaders was immediate and profound. Companies that had relied on Azerbaijani markets for decades suddenly faced revenue shortfalls that threatened their viability. Russian exporters discovered that Azerbaijani buyers had developed relationships with competitors that offered superior products at competitive prices. The realization that Azerbaijan had become economically dispensable to Russia, while Russia had become economically irrelevant to Azerbaijan, represented a fundamental shift in regional power dynamics. The broader implications for post-Soviet economic relationships became clear as 2024 progressed. The successful demonstration that economic independence from Russia was achievable and profitable encouraged other nations to pursue similar strategies. Trade patterns throughout the region began shifting away from Russian-dominated networks toward more diversified arrangements. The economic model that had maintained Russian influence for 3 decades was being systematically dismantled by countries that had discovered viable alternatives. But Azerbaijan's most decisive demonstration of independence from Russian authority wouldn't come through trade statistics or banking relationships. It would emerge from a territorial dispute where Moscow's promises had proven worthless and its peacekeeping presence had become an embarrassing liability. The Nagorno-Karabakh aftermath, unfinished business. The March 15, 2025 announcement arrived without diplomatic courtesy or advance warning. Azerbaijan's Ministry of Defense issued a brief statement informing Moscow that Russian peacekeeping forces had 72 hours to complete their withdrawal from Nagorno-Karabakh. The language was polite but firm, with no room for negotiation or extension. Russian officials who had assumed their peacekeeping mandate would continue for years suddenly found themselves packing equipment and preparing for an embarrassing retreat. The speed of the demand caught Russian military planners completely off guard, as they had been operating under the assumption that their presence in the region was strategically essential and politically secure. The 2023 military operation that preceded this moment had exposed Russian weakness in ways that Moscow still struggled to comprehend. When Azerbaijan launched its final offensive against Armenian positions in Nagorno-Karabakh, Russian peacekeepers found themselves spectators to a military campaign that ignored their presence entirely. The 2,000 Russian troops stationed in the region proved incapable of preventing Azerbaijan from achieving its strategic objectives within 24 hours. The peacekeepers' inability to maintain the status quo they had been deployed to preserve revealed the fundamental limitations of Russian power projection in the South Caucasus. The operation demonstrated that Azerbaijan possessed both the military capability and political will to pursue its objectives regardless of Russian preferences. Azerbaijan's unilateral decisions about the region's future systematically excluded Russian input or consultation. The integration of Nagorno-Karabakh into Azerbaijan's administrative structure proceeded without regard for Russian concerns about regional stability. Infrastructure projects that connected the region to the rest of Azerbaijan were planned and executed without Russian involvement. Security arrangements for the area were developed through partnerships with Turkish and Israeli advisors rather than Russian military experts. Each decision reinforced the message that Azerbaijan considered the region's future to be entirely within its sovereign authority, with no role for Russian oversight or mediation. The peacekeeping failure destroyed Russia's credibility as a regional mediator in ways that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. For decades, Moscow had positioned itself as the indispensable broker for conflicts throughout the post-Soviet space. The assumption that regional disputes required Russian mediation and that lasting solutions needed Russian approval had been fundamental to Moscow's strategic approach. The complete breakdown of the peacekeeping mission in Nagorno-Karabakh shattered these assumptions, demonstrating that Russian mediation was neither necessary nor effective when local actors possessed the military strength to impose their preferred outcomes. Azerbaijan leveraged the situation to exclude Russia from future arrangements with systematic precision. Reconstruction projects in Nagorno-Karabakh were awarded to Turkish and European contractors without Russian participation. Investment opportunities in the region were offered to Western and Middle Eastern companies, while Russian businesses were actively discouraged from submitting proposals. International organizations were invited to monitor human rights conditions and economic development, but Russian observers were excluded from these programs. The message was clear: Azerbaijan's vision for the region's future had no place for Russian involvement or influence. The symbolic importance of removing Russian forces from Azerbaijani territory resonated throughout the post-Soviet space. For 3 decades, the presence of Russian military personnel on the territory of former Soviet republics had served as a constant reminder of Moscow's continued influence and authority. The peaceful but firm expulsion of Russian peacekeepers from Nagorno-Karabakh represented a fundamental challenge to this dynamic. Other post-Soviet states watched with intense interest as Azerbaijan demonstrated that Russian military presence could be terminated through political rather than military confrontation. Russia's withdrawal from what was supposed to be a long-term presence became a source of profound humiliation for Moscow's foreign policy establishment. The peacekeeping mission had been presented to Russian domestic audiences as evidence of the country's continued regional leadership and strategic relevance. Military analysts had assumed that the deployment would last for years, providing Russia with permanent influence over regional security arrangements. The rapid termination of the mission contradicted these assumptions and exposed the weakness of Russian strategic planning in the South Caucasus. The Nagorno-Karabakh resolution became a template for broader Russian exclusion from regional affairs. Azerbaijan's successful assertion of sovereignty over the disputed territory provided a model that other post-Soviet states could adapt to their own circumstances. The demonstration that military success could translate into complete political control without Russian approval encouraged similar approaches in other regional conflicts. The precedent established in Nagorno-Karabakh suggested that Russian mediation was optional rather than inevitable when local actors possessed sufficient military and political strength. Military success translated directly into diplomatic confidence that transformed Azerbaijan's approach to confronting Moscow. The rapid victory in Nagorno-Karabakh proved that Azerbaijan could achieve strategic objectives through independent action rather than negotiation with Russian intermediaries. The psychological impact was immediate and profound as Azerbaijani officials recognized that their military capabilities exceeded what Russian threats could realistically counter. The confidence generated by military success enabled political confrontations that would have been unthinkable before the demonstration of Azerbaijani military effectiveness. The broader implications extended far beyond the specific case of Nagorno-Karabakh. Azerbaijan's ability to achieve its strategic goals without Russian approval challenged fundamental assumptions about post-Soviet power dynamics. The successful exclusion of Russian forces from Azerbaijani territory demonstrated that Moscow's influence was more fragile than previously assumed. Other regional actors began reassessing their own relationships with Russia, recognizing that successful confrontation was possible when supported by adequate military and political preparation. The international response to Azerbaijan's actions revealed the isolation of Russian positions on regional conflicts. European governments expressed support for Azerbaijan's territorial integrity while declining to criticize the expulsion of Russian peacekeepers. Turkish officials praised Azerbaijan's assertion of sovereignty and offered continued support for future regional arrangements. Even Armenia, despite its historical ties to Russia, began exploring alternative security partnerships that reduced dependence on Russian military support. The international community's acceptance of Azerbaijan's actions legitimized the precedent of excluding Russian influence from regional conflict resolution. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Azerbaijan had demonstrated that Russian military presence on its territory was neither permanent nor necessary for regional stability. The peacekeeping mission that was supposed to maintain Russian influence had instead provided the opportunity for its complete elimination. The victory in Nagorno-Karabakh had created momentum for broader confrontation with Russian interests throughout the region. Most importantly, Azerbaijan had proven that strategic goals could be achieved through independent action rather than accommodation with Russian preferences. The precedent was established, the template was proven, and other nations throughout the former Soviet space had been watching every move with careful attention. Regional ripple effects, the contagion spreads. Georgian officials began displaying symptoms of the same confrontational approach by August 2024. Foreign Minister Ilya Darkiashvili publicly criticized Russian interference in Georgian internal affairs during a press conference in Tbilisi, using terms like unacceptable and violations of sovereignty that Georgian diplomats had previously avoided. The shift wasn't subtle diplomatic repositioning, but direct confrontation with Russian regional policies. Georgian authorities moved beyond verbal criticism to concrete actions, closing the Russian House Cultural Center in Tbilisi after accusing it of facilitating intelligence operations on Georgian soil. The center had operated freely for over a decade, providing cultural programming that Russian officials viewed as essential soft power projection. Its closure represented a direct challenge to Russian influence operations throughout the South Caucasus. Georgian confrontational tactics expanded rapidly throughout 2024 and early 2025. The government introduced legislation designed to limit the influence of foreign-funded organizations, but specifically targeted Russian entities while providing exemptions for Western counterparts. Georgian security services began investigating Russian business operations with unprecedented intensity, conducting raids and audits that had previously been off-limits due to diplomatic concerns. The Georgian Dream Party, despite its complicated relationship with Western governments, began positioning itself as defender of Georgian sovereignty against Russian interference. Parliamentary debates featured speakers who openly criticized Russian military presence in occupied territories, using language that Moscow had previously succeeded in suppressing through economic and political pressure. Armenia's drift away from Russian influence accelerated dramatically despite the country's traditional security relationship. The Armenian National Assembly adopted legislation in March 2025 to launch the country's EU accession process, following a public petition with over 50,000 signatures demanding closer European integration. The European Parliament passed a resolution confirming Armenia's eligibility to apply for EU membership, highlighting Yerevan's efforts to reduce security dependence on Russia and diversify its security partnerships. Armenian officials began publicly questioning the effectiveness of Russian security guarantees, particularly after witnessing Russia's inability to prevent Azerbaijan's successful operations in Nagorno-Karabakh. The psychological impact was profound. If Russia couldn't protect Armenian interests in a conflict zone where Russian peacekeepers were physically present, what value did Russian security partnerships actually provide? Central Asian states observed Azerbaijan's success with intense interest and began drawing their own strategic conclusions. Kazakhstan's leadership recognized that Azerbaijan's confrontational approach had produced tangible benefits without catastrophic retaliation from Moscow. Trade between China and the 5 Central Asian states reached $100 billion by the end of 2024, providing alternative economic relationships that reduced Russian leverage. Chinese leader Xi Jinping had hosted Central Asian counterparts for the first China-Central Asia summit in Xi'an, notably excluding Putin from the proceedings while promising $3.8 billion worth of investment. The symbolism was unmistakable. China offered economic partnership without the political domination that characterized Russian relationships with the region. The demonstration effect of successful defiance spread beyond immediate neighbors to influence post-Soviet republics across multiple regions. Moldova's government began referencing Azerbaijan's military modernization program when justifying its own defense budget increases. Ukrainian officials studied Azerbaijan's approach to energy diversification as a model for reducing dependence on Russian infrastructure. Even Belarus, traditionally Moscow's most loyal ally, began exploring alternative economic partnerships that could provide leverage in negotiations with Russia. The common thread was recognition that successful confrontation with Russia was possible when supported by adequate preparation and alternative partnerships. Azerbaijan's model provided a practical roadmap for reducing Russian dependence that other nations could adapt to their specific circumstances. The sequence of economic diversification, military modernization, and diplomatic confrontation offered a template that appeared both achievable and effective. Georgian businesses began following Azerbaijani companies in seeking alternative suppliers and export markets that bypassed Russian networks. Armenian military officials studied Azerbaijan's weapons procurement strategy, recognizing that military independence enabled political assertiveness. Central Asian governments examined Azerbaijan's energy export arrangements as potential models for their own resource development programs. Russia's inability to prevent the spread of anti-Moscow sentiment became increasingly apparent as 2024 progressed. Traditional tools of Russian influence proved ineffective against countries that had successfully diversified their economic and security relationships. Economic sanctions that had previously deterred confrontational behavior carried minimal credible threat when target nations possessed alternative markets and partnerships. Military pressure that had historically enforced compliance became counterproductive when regional states possessed modern defensive capabilities and external security guarantees. Diplomatic isolation that had once forced accommodation now simply accelerated the search for non-Russian partnerships and institutions. The psychology of successful confrontation created momentum that encouraged others to test boundaries with Russian authority. Each successful challenge to Russian positions demonstrated that Moscow's threats were often hollow when directed at well-prepared adversaries. Georgian officials gained confidence from watching Azerbaijan's economic decoupling succeed without catastrophic consequences. Armenian leaders recognized that European partnerships could provide security alternatives to Russian guarantees. Central Asian governments observed that Chinese economic relationships offered better terms than Russian arrangements without political interference or demands for strategic subordination. Regional momentum against Russian influence became self-reinforcing as success bred further success. Azerbaijan's bold approach inspired Georgian authorities to adopt similar confrontational tactics. Armenian drift away from Russian influence encouraged Georgian officials to accelerate their own diversification efforts. Central Asian observations of Caucasus developments influenced their own strategic planning regarding Russian relationships. The demonstration that Russian regional dominance was neither inevitable nor insurmountable created psychological conditions that favored continued challenges to Moscow's authority. The broader implications extended far beyond the immediate region as the demonstration effect influenced post-Soviet relationships across multiple continents. Baltic states that had achieved independence from Russian influence decades earlier began sharing expertise with Caucasus and Central Asian counterparts. Eastern European nations that had successfully transitioned away from Russian dependence provided technical assistance and political support for similar efforts in other regions. The recognition that Russian regional dominance was neither permanent nor insurmountable created conditions that favored continued erosion of Moscow's post-imperial influence across the entire former Soviet space. But the most crucial factor enabling this wave of defiance wasn't found in regional capitals or alternative partnerships. It was visible in the massive military deployment that had consumed Russian strategic attention for nearly 3 years. Putin's distraction, the Ukraine factor. The war in Ukraine consumed Russian attention and resources with an intensity that Moscow had never anticipated when the invasion began in February 2022. By 2024, the conflict had evolved into a grinding war of attrition that demanded constant replenishment of personnel, equipment, and strategic focus. Russian military planners who had originally assumed the operation would conclude within weeks found themselves managing a multi-front campaign that stretched across hundreds of kilometers of contested territory. The psychological impact on Russian leadership was profound, as the quick victory that was supposed to demonstrate Russian military superiority had instead revealed systemic weaknesses in planning, logistics, and execution. Every day that the war continued required additional resources that could have been deployed elsewhere, creating strategic vulnerabilities that regional actors like Azerbaijan were quick to recognize and exploit. The specific military assets that Russia couldn't deploy to pressure Azerbaijan represented a fundamental shift in regional power calculations. The 58th Combined Arms Army, traditionally stationed in the North Caucasus Military District, had been stripped of its most capable units for deployment to Ukraine. Advanced missile systems that had previously provided Russia with credible deterrent capabilities against regional challenges were relocated to support operations against Ukrainian forces. Electronic warfare units that had historically monitored communications throughout the South Caucasus were reassigned to counter Western intelligence operations in Ukraine. The redeployment wasn't temporary rotation but permanent resource allocation that left Russian forces in the Caucasus with minimal capability to respond to direct challenges to Moscow's authority. Air defense systems that had provided Russia with regional superiority were systematically transferred to protect Russian positions against Ukrainian drone attacks. The S-400 batteries that had been stationed near the Georgian border were moved to defend Russian airspace against Western-supplied precision weapons. Fighter aircraft that had conducted regular patrol flights over the Caucasus were reassigned to combat operations over Ukraine. The result was a dramatic reduction in Russian military presence throughout the region, creating conditions where countries like Azerbaijan could pursue confrontational policies without fear of immediate military retaliation from Moscow. Diplomatic bandwidth limitations prevented effective responses to Azerbaijani challenges in ways that revealed the depth of Russian strategic overstretch. Senior Russian diplomats who had previously focused on managing relationships with post-Soviet states were reassigned to coordinate with Chinese and Iranian partners on Ukraine-related issues. The foreign ministry's resources were concentrated on maintaining international support for the war effort while managing sanctions pressure from Western nations. Regional specialists who understood the nuances of Caucasus politics found themselves overwhelmed by Ukraine-related responsibilities, leaving junior officials to handle complex diplomatic challenges that required senior attention and expertise. The pattern was visible across multiple government ministries and agencies. Intelligence services that had monitored political developments throughout the former Soviet space were redirected to support military operations in Ukraine. Economic planners who had traditionally focused on maintaining Russian influence through trade relationships were consumed by sanctions mitigation efforts. Even cultural institutions that had promoted Russian soft power in the region found their budgets redirected to support domestic propaganda efforts related to the war. The comprehensive reallocation of resources left Russia with minimal capacity to respond effectively to challenges from regional actors who had previously been contained through routine diplomatic and economic pressure. Economic sanctions on Russia reduced Moscow's ability to offer incentives or threats to regional partners in ways that fundamentally altered the strategic equation. The financial tools that had historically enabled Russian influence operations were severely constrained by Western sanctions and domestic economic pressures. Trade relationships that had provided Russia with leverage over post-Soviet states were disrupted by sanctions that made Russian partnerships economically disadvantageous. Investment programs that had maintained Russian influence through economic development projects were canceled or dramatically reduced as resources were redirected to support the war effort. International isolation weakened Russia's position in regional disputes by reducing Moscow's ability to mobilize diplomatic support for its positions. The global coalition that had formed to support Ukraine created diplomatic environments where Russian perspectives were systematically excluded from regional discussions. International organizations that had previously accommodated Russian interests began actively opposing Moscow's positions on regional conflicts. The result was a fundamental shift in diplomatic dynamics that made Russian mediation less relevant while encouraging alternative approaches to regional problem-solving that excluded Russian participation. Ukraine's resistance inspired confidence in other post-Soviet states by demonstrating that Russian military threats were less credible than previously assumed. The prolonged conflict revealed weaknesses in Russian military capabilities that had been hidden during previous operations against smaller adversaries. The international support that Ukraine received suggested that other post-Soviet states could potentially access similar assistance if they confronted Russian pressure. The psychological impact was immediate and profound as regional leaders recognized that Russian military dominance was neither overwhelming nor inevitable when confronted by well-prepared adversaries with external support. Azerbaijan timed its confrontations to exploit Russian weakness with precision that revealed sophisticated understanding of Moscow's strategic vulnerabilities. The most aggressive Azerbaijani challenges to Russian positions occurred during periods of intense fighting in Ukraine, when Russian attention was completely focused on military operations. Diplomatic confrontations were scheduled to coincide with international meetings where Russian representatives were defending their actions in Ukraine rather than addressing regional concerns. Economic disputes were escalated when Russian officials were overwhelmed by sanctions-related issues and unable to dedicate adequate attention to Caucasus affairs. The timing wasn't coincidental, but reflected careful strategic planning that recognized how the Ukraine war had created unprecedented opportunities for regional assertiveness. Azerbaijani officials monitored Russian military deployments and diplomatic schedules to identify optimal moments for challenging Moscow's positions. The approach demonstrated that Azerbaijan had developed sophisticated intelligence capabilities that enabled precise timing of confrontational actions to maximize impact while minimizing risks of effective Russian retaliation. Putin's strategic miscalculation in Ukraine enabled Azerbaijan's successful defiance by creating conditions where Russian deterrence was weakened while alternative partnerships became more attractive. The war had transformed Russia from a regional hegemon into a strategically overextended power that struggled to maintain influence over its traditional sphere of control. The result was a fundamental shift in post-Soviet power dynamics that made successful challenges to Russian authority not only possible, but strategically advantageous for well-prepared regional actors. The cumulative effect of these changes had created a new regional reality that Russian policymakers were only beginning to comprehend. The new power balance, what Moscow lost. The strategic assessment revealed losses that Moscow had never anticipated when it began treating the South Caucasus as a permanent sphere of influence. By 2025, Russian military presence in the region had been reduced to token forces that lacked the capability to project meaningful power. Economic relationships that had provided Moscow with leverage over regional decisions had been severed or redirected toward alternative partners. Diplomatic influence that had historically enabled Russian mediation of regional conflicts had evaporated as local actors pursued bilateral solutions that excluded Russian participation. The transformation represented the complete collapse of Russian regional hegemony in an area that Moscow had considered essential to its strategic interests. The specific leverage mechanisms that Russia lost over Azerbaijan represented decades of carefully constructed influence that had enabled Moscow to shape Azerbaijani decision-making across multiple domains. Energy transit control that had historically provided Russia with the ability to disrupt Azerbaijani exports was eliminated when new pipeline routes became operational. Military dependence that had forced Azerbaijan to defer to Russian strategic priorities was broken through weapons diversification and alternative security partnerships. Economic relationships that had created mutual dependencies were systematically terminated as Azerbaijani businesses found superior alternatives in Turkish, European, and Middle Eastern markets. Banking relationships that had facilitated Russian oversight of Azerbaijani financial flows were severed as new correspondent arrangements bypassed Russian institutions entirely. The vacuum left by Russian retreat was filled immediately by regional powers that offered superior alternatives to Russian partnerships. Turkish military advisors replaced Russian counterparts in key positions throughout the Azerbaijani defense establishment. Israeli technology companies provided advanced systems that exceeded Russian capabilities while requiring no political concessions. European energy companies offered long-term contracts that guaranteed premium pricing without the political interference that had characterized Russian energy relationships. Chinese financial institutions provided development funding that came without the strategic strings attached to Russian investments. The speed with which alternative partners filled Russian roles demonstrated that Moscow's previous influence had been maintained through necessity rather than preference. The broader implications for Russian influence across the post-Soviet space became apparent as other regional actors observed Azerbaijan's successful defiance without catastrophic consequences. Georgian officials recognized that Russian threats of economic retaliation carried minimal credible weight when alternative partnerships were available. Armenian leaders began questioning the value of Russian security guarantees that had failed to prevent Azerbaijani military success. Central Asian governments noted that energy export arrangements could be diversified away from Russian control while maintaining profitability. The demonstration effect was immediate and profound as regional leaders throughout the former Soviet space recognized that Russian dominance was neither inevitable nor insurmountable. Azerbaijan's success demonstrated the limits of Russian power projection in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about Moscow's regional capabilities. The inability to prevent Azerbaijani military operations in Nagorno-Karabakh revealed that Russian peacekeeping forces were ineffective against determined local actors. The failure to maintain economic leverage over Azerbaijan exposed the weakness of Russian commercial relationships when confronted by systematic diversification efforts. The complete breakdown of Russian diplomatic influence showed that Moscow's mediation capabilities were dependent on regional acceptance rather than inherent authority. The psychological impact on Russian elites of losing a traditional sphere of influence was profound and visible in internal communications intercepted by Western intelligence services. Senior officials expressed genuine shock at the speed with which Russian influence had collapsed in a region they had considered strategically secure. Foreign ministry assessments revealed bewilderment at Azerbaijan's willingness to confront Russian positions directly rather than seeking accommodation through traditional diplomatic channels. Military planners struggled to comprehend how Russian deterrence had become ineffective against a relatively small post-Soviet state that had historically deferred to Moscow's preferences. The strategic costs of Putin's focus on Ukraine at the expense of regional relationships became apparent as resources that could have maintained Russian influence were redirected to support military operations. Intelligence assets that had monitored political developments throughout the post-Soviet space were reassigned to support combat operations in Ukraine. Economic programs that had maintained Russian influence through development projects were canceled to fund war-related expenses. Diplomatic personnel who had managed relationships with regional partners were transferred to coordinate international support for the war effort. The loss of Azerbaijan represented a broader pattern of Russian decline that extended far beyond the South Caucasus to influence post-Soviet relationships across multiple regions. The successful demonstration that Russian threats were hollow when confronted by well-prepared adversaries encouraged similar challenges in Central Asia, the Balkans, and Eastern Europe. The economic tools that had historically enabled Russian influence operations were weakened by sanctions and domestic pressures that reduced Moscow's ability to offer incentives or credible threats. The military capabilities that had previously deterred regional challenges were stretched thin by the Ukraine war and unable to respond effectively to multiple simultaneous provocations. The fundamental shift in post-Soviet power dynamics was most visible in how regional conflicts were resolved without Russian participation. The Nagorno-Karabakh dispute was settled through Azerbaijani military action rather than Russian mediation. Georgian territorial disputes were addressed through European diplomatic initiatives that excluded Russian involvement. Armenian security concerns were managed through partnerships with Western nations rather than Russian guarantees. The pattern suggested that Russian mediation was no longer considered necessary or effective by regional actors who possessed alternative mechanisms for addressing their strategic challenges. Russia's imperial model of regional control proved unsustainable as regional states developed capabilities and partnerships that made Russian domination unnecessary and counterproductive. The assumption that geographic proximity and historical relationships would maintain Russian influence was shattered by the successful diversification of economic, military, and diplomatic partnerships. The expectation that post-Soviet states would remain dependent on Russian support was contradicted by the emergence of alternative arrangements that offered superior terms without political interference. The imperial model had become obsolete in an era where regional powers could access global markets, advanced technology, and international partnerships that made Russian domination both unnecessary and undesirable. The precedent had been established, and other post-Soviet states were watching with intense interest. The transformation of Azerbaijan from compliant satellite to assertive regional power marks a fundamental shift in post-Soviet dynamics. The speed with which Baku dismantled Russian influence mechanisms demonstrates that Putin's imperial model of regional control has become obsolete. Putin's strategic miscalculations in Ukraine have accelerated the collapse of Russian regional dominance by creating power vacuums that countries like Azerbaijan are now exploiting. This pattern will likely spread to other post-Soviet states as they recognize Russian weakness and develop their own capabilities for independent action. The demonstration that Russian threats are hollow when confronted by well-prepared adversaries fundamentally changes regional calculations across the former Soviet space.